The chamber was a stage of tension and ego, every spotlight amplifying the storm that was about to break. Senator Ted Cruz's voice thundered through the ornate room, slicing the air with precision. "Representative Crockett," he began, his tone dripping with mock civility. "Your voting record reads like a betrayal of the very people you claim to represent. How do you defend voting against the moral fabric of this nation?" Cameras zoomed in. His smirk widened, confident that the clip would dominate the evening news. Behind him, aides exchanged subtle nods, the kind of approval born from rehearsed outrage. Every word was measured to sting, every pause designed for the soundbite. But Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She stood still, her poise disarming. The room, once loud with murmurs and shifting papers, began to quiet. She adjusted her blazer, not in defense, but as though preparing for something deliberate, something precise. Her gaze met Cruz's, unflinching. "Senator," she said softly, yet her voice carried to every corner of the hall. "Are you sure you want to finish that sentence?" The words landed like a thunderclap, wrapped in velvet. The crowd froze. A single cough echoed and died. For a moment, Cruz seemed to falter, his rhythm broken, his practiced sneer flickering into confusion. Jasmine's calm cut deeper than any rebuttal. She didn't shout. She didn't raise her hand. Her stillness was the response a mirror held up to arrogance. A reporter in the back lowered his camera, realizing he might be witnessing the kind of moment that rewrites reputations. Staffers leaned forward, whispers spilling down the rows. The tension grew tangible, a pulse running through every spectator. Cruz shifted in his seat, searching for footing. "Excuse me," he managed, his voice a note higher than before. But Jasmine only tilted her head slightly, her expression unchanged. Calm, collected, quietly dangerous. No one could look away. The balance of power in that room had changed in a single breath. And as the silence deepened, one truth became clear. This was no longer Cruz's performance. It was Jasmine's moment to define. As tensions reached a boiling point, few could predict what was coming. Across America, the temperature of public life had reached a fever pitch. Every headline felt like a battlefield. Every tweet, a declaration of war. Talk shows turned truth into spectacle, and outrage had become the national language. In that noise, Senator Ted Cruz thrived, fluent in provocation, practiced in the art of spectacle. He didn't just debate. He performed conflict, weaponized it, and built a political empire on its sparks. For years, he'd found easy targets, the idealistic, the reformers, the ones who believed change could outlast cynicism. But on this day, his spotlight fell on someone different. Representative Jasmine Crockett wasn't built in the mold of cautious politicians. She was loud when truth demanded it, calm when pressure arose, and utterly unafraid to call hypocrisy by its name. The hearing was supposed to be another performance for Cruz, a chance to corner a rising Democratic star, to make headlines that played well to his base. He came armed with talking points, statistics torn from context, and the assurance that this moment would belong to him. He expected Crockett to fold under the weight of his rehearsed disdain. But outside the marble walls, something in the public mood had shifted. Americans were tired not of politics, but of the hollow theater it had become. They wanted authenticity, the kind that couldn't be faked in a press release. They wanted someone to speak not to power, but through it. And Jasmine had a voice that could cut through all the noise. She hadn't come to this hearing as a politician defending herself. She came as the product of struggle, of courtrooms and communities that had taught her resilience. She carried the weight of those who'd been unheard, unseen, underestimated. And in that moment, that weight became her armor. Cruz didn't see it, or maybe he refused to. To him, this was just another duel on camera, another headline crafted in advance. But for Jasmine, it was personal. Every accusation against her record wasn't just political theater. It was a challenge to the integrity she had spent her life building. As the lights burned hotter and the questions turned sharper, she met each one not with anger, but with precision. Her silence was not surrender, it was strategy. Her pauses intentional. Her composure unshakable. In the audience, a young intern whispered, "She's not playing his game." And she wasn't. Because Jasmine Crockett had never been anyone's prop in a performance. She was the storm that rewrites the script. This wasn't just another exchange in Washington. It was a collision of two Americas, one built on showmanship and self-interest, and another built on service, substance, and soul. And somewhere beyond that hearing room, millions watching felt something they hadn't felt in a long time: pride. Not in partisanship, but in seeing someone stand tall without losing grace. The stakes were no longer about one senator or one representative. They were about what kind of leadership the nation still believed in. As Cruz pressed his attack, the entire nation leaned closer to their screens. Ted Cruz had always known how to command a room. His voice, measured, articulate, steeped in moral certainty, was crafted for headlines and cable news clips. To many, he was the intellectual general of America's culture wars. A man who could quote scripture and the Constitution in the same breath, wielding both like twin swords. But the path that brought him here was paved as much by ambition as by ideology. Born to a story he often mythologized, Cruz loved to remind the public that he was the son of a Cuban immigrant, a tale meant to echo perseverance and faith. Yet somewhere between his father's dream and his own destiny, that story hardened into self-interest. Harvard Law had refined his brilliance, but it also sharpened his arrogance. He didn't just debate to win. He debated to dominate, to dismantle, to humiliate. In Washington's corridors, his reputation preceded him: brilliant, yes, but impossible to like. He built his empire on outrage. On the Senate floor, he was the lightning rod, the firebrand. He wrapped himself in the language of conviction while performing for the cameras that never stopped rolling. To his followers, he was a warrior for truth. To his critics, he was the architect of division. He condemned elites even as he sought their approval. He mocked the performative politics of others while perfecting his own brand of televised indignation. Behind every sermon about moral decay was a calculation: how it would play on Fox, how it would trend on Twitter, how it would raise money by midnight. He had mastered the rhythm of modern politics: outrage, amplify, retreat, repeat. But something had changed in the years since his first meteoric rise. The once fiery outsider had become the enforcer of the old guard, protecting power from disruption. He'd traded rebellion for authority, populism for control. When new voices emerged, women, people of color, progressives who refused to play by old rules, Cruz saw not evolution but threat. That's why Jasmine Crockett unnerved him. She wasn't afraid to speak with conviction. She wasn't molded by lobbyists or corporate donors. She came from the courtrooms, not the country clubs. To Cruz, her rise represented everything his brand of politics could not contain: authenticity. In closed-door meetings, aides whispered that Cruz had grown restless. His speeches no longer drew the same spark. The algorithms that once elevated his sound bites were turning cold. Younger voters weren't tuning in. They were scrolling past him, drawn instead to figures like Crockett voices that spoke to lived experience, not manufactured outrage. So he chose her as a target, not just to discredit her, but to reclaim his spotlight. The hearing would be his arena, his redemption arc. He would frame her as reckless, un-American, morally unmoored. The cameras would capture his righteousness, and the headlines would declare him victorious. That was the plan. Yet beneath the polish and posturing, cracks had begun to show. His certainty wavered in moments unseen, the flash of hesitation in his gaze when challenged, the subtle strain in his rehearsed cadence. The applause that once followed his speeches had grown thinner, more perfunctory. Even within his own ranks, the whispers were louder. He's lost his edge. Cruz ignored them. He convinced himself that dominance was the same as respect, that moral theater was still power. But deep down, he felt the ground shifting beneath him. The age of control was giving way to the age of authenticity, and men like him were losing their grip. That's why, when Jasmine Crockett took her seat across from him, he felt something unfamiliar and unease he couldn't name. Her calm wasn't weakness. It was control. Her silence wasn't retreat. It was preparation. And though he would never admit it, part of him knew that this exchange might not end the way he expected. He leaned forward, ready to strike, blind to the truth unraveling around him. Because in the theater of power, arrogance always mistakes the spotlight for invincibility. But behind the confident facade, cracks were forming that few had noticed. Before Jasmine Crockett ever walked through the halls of Congress, she walked through neighborhoods where justice was a rumor and hope came in fragments. Her journey didn't begin with headlines or cameras. It began in small, crowded courtrooms where the forgotten fought for their lives. She was a public defender, not because it was glamorous, but because it was necessary. Because someone had to stand beside the people the system decided were expendable. She learned early that justice in America wasn't blind, it just looked away. She watched single mothers lose custody because they couldn't afford a lawyer. She watched young men face years behind bars because the color of their skin outweighed the strength of their defense. And through it all, she fought. Not with privilege, but with persistence. Every case was a battle against indifference. Every verdict a measure of humanity. In those early years, Crockett built her armor. It wasn't made of wealth or pedigree. It was made of the faces of the people she defended. The grandmother who wept after a wrongful eviction. The teenager who said, "You're the first person who believed me." The father who walked free after months in jail because she refused to quit. Each of them added a layer of conviction to her spirit. Each taught her that the law, when wielded with courage, could be an instrument of dignity. By the time she entered politics, she had already been baptized by fire. Congress was just a bigger courtroom, louder, meaner, but no more honest. Her speeches carried the same energy she once brought before a skeptical judge, a balance of empathy and fury. She didn't rehearse her passion, she lived it. And when she spoke, people listened. Her rise was not smooth. For every supporter who called her the voice of truth, there was a critic who sneered that she was too bold, too emotional, too loud. But those words never broke her. They built her. Because Jasmine understood something her detractors never would, that being too much was often the only way for women like her to be heard at all. She faced scrutiny that had nothing to do with policy. Her tone, her clothing, even her hair became political talking points. Yet she refused to shrink. Each insult only deepened her resolve. She carried herself with a grace that came not from privilege, but from endurance, the kind that's learned in courtrooms where you're outnumbered, and in neighborhoods where victory means simply being seen. In her first term, she became known for her fiery committee speeches, sharp, eloquent, unfiltered. When others wavered, she pressed harder. When opponents twisted facts, she corrected them line by line. Her confidence was never arrogance. It was memory. The memory of every injustice she had witnessed, every silence she had turned into speech. To her supporters, she was the truth with heels on, fearless, polished, and impossible to ignore. But underneath the applause, she carried something quieter, gratitude. Gratitude for the people who believed in her before anyone else did. Gratitude for the struggle that sharpened her purpose. What Cruz and others like him never understood was that Jasmine Crockett didn't seek the spotlight. She simply refused to stand in the shadows. She wasn't playing their game. She was rewriting the rules. Her faith grounded her, not in performative piety, but in action. She lived the scripture others only quoted. "Let justice roll down like waters," she once said, echoing Amos, "and righteousness like a mighty stream." It wasn't a slogan. It was a calling. So when she entered that Senate hearing, she didn't walk in as a politician defending her record. She walked in as the embodiment of everything her record stood for: the struggle for fairness, fight for dignity, the refusal to be silenced. The weight of her journey sat invisible on her shoulders, but it showed in her calm. Every interruption, every condescending remark from Cruz, every attempt to twist her words, it all bounced off the armor. She had forged through years of surviving harder battles than this one. The courtroom had taught her that power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits, watches, listens, and then, when the moment comes, it speaks truth so clear that no spin can smother it. That was Jasmine Crockett's real weapon, not rhetoric, but authenticity. The kind that comes only from living what you preach. And that authenticity, that unshakable sense of purpose, would soon collide with Cruz's arrogance in a way no one in that chamber or the nation watching would forget. It was these very struggles that would give her the strength to deliver a moment history wouldn't forget. Cruz leaned forward, elbows on the table, his voice carrying that familiar blend of disdain and self-assuredness. "So, Representative Crockett, are you proud of voting against the people of Texas?" The words landed like an accusation wrapped in a grin. The cameras turned to Jasmine, hungry for a reaction. The air grew heavy, charged. Every staffer, every journalist in that chamber could feel it. The rhythm of political combat tightening like a drum. Cruz smirked, convinced he had cornered her. Certain that this would be the soundbite replayed across every network by nightfall. But Jasmine didn't rush. She didn't blink. She let the silence expand, filling the chamber until the echo of his question began to sound absurd. Seconds stretched into something more powerful than words, the kind of stillness that exposes insecurity. Then, in a tone so calm, it sliced sharper than any shout, she said, "I voted for people who can't afford your kind of politics, Senator." It was measured, precise, deadly. A murmur rippled across the room, journalists whispering, aides stiffening. From the back, a few muffled oohs broke the tension, like sparks jumping from dry kindling. Even Cruz's smirk faltered just slightly as he shifted in his seat. He forced a nervous laugh, the kind that tried to mask irritation. "Well," he stammered, gesturing toward her papers, "that's quite a line, Representative, but perhaps you should spend less time rehearsing slogans and more time reading legislation." Jasmine tilted her head, eyes unwavering. "I read every word, Senator," she replied evenly. "That's how I know which ones are written for people and which ones are written for headlines." The room erupted in subtle gasps and murmurs. It wasn't just a clapback. It was an unmasking. The confidence drained from Cruz's expression, replaced by something harder to disguise. Frustration. He tried again, his tone sharpening. "So, you admit that your votes align with the radical left's agenda? That you'd rather appease coastal elites than the working families of Texas?" This time, Jasmine didn't let him finish. "The working families of Texas," she said. Leaning forward just enough to close the space between them, deserve honesty. And they deserve leaders who don't use their pain as a prop. It landed like a gavel. The journalists' pens froze midair. Even the camera operators leaned closer, instinctively zooming in. The tension was no longer about policy, it had become moral. A test of character laid bare for the nation to witness. Cruz tried to interject, but his rhythm was gone. His usual dominance, the rehearsed certainty, the showman's flair, had crumbled in the face of her restraint. Each time he raised his voice, it only made Jasmine's composure more powerful.